Langworthy from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am very proud to have introduced H.R. 3642, the Executive Branch Accountability and Transparency Act, which would require executive branch agencies to create publicly accessible databases for the ethics records and financial disclosures of their non-career employees. While our current ethics system, based on disclosure, disqualification, and divestiture, aims to regulate conflicts of interest, accessing ethics records on executive branch officials by the public so that they can see it themselves whether conflicts of interest exist remains a challenge. These individuals are public servants, and their financial disclosures and ethics records should be readily available for public scrutiny, not scattered across the obscure corners of a government website. My bill, H.R. 3642, would ensure that this information is consolidated in a publicly accessible database so that any American citizen can see for themselves that non-career employees in our federal government are in full compliance with ethics rules and are held to the strict standard of transparency as required by law. H.R. 3642 would further require the Office of Government Ethics to guide agencies in creating accessible websites for these records, ensuring that the databases are developed in a manner that doesn't continue to obscure these documents from the outside world. And finally, my bill allows for bulk downloads of documents, streamlines public access to ethics disclosures, and ensures that all of these records are kept online for a period of 6 years. H.R. 3642 will accomplish this while only ensuring that a sensitive request for ethics guidance and any other private or sensitive information is not publicized. My bill today builds on efforts like the Stock Act and the Courthouse Ethics and Transparency Act to improve transparency within our government. I am proud to share that H.R. 3642 enjoys support from a bipartisan coalition of members, many of whom are members of this committee. I encourage my colleagues to support this important step towards greater transparency in the government and accountability. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Do any other members seek recognition?
Ms. Norton.
The chair will recognize Ms. Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will distribute the amendment to all members. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3642 is offered by Ms. Norton of the District of Columbia.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. I reserve a point of order. The gentlelady from Washington, D.C. is recognized for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
I ask unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read. Mr. Chairman, while I support the goal of this bill, I oppose the application of this bill to employees of the District of Columbia. My amendment would strike this application. This bill applies to, among others, and I'm quoting, a special government employee as defined in Section 202A of Title 18 of the U.S. Code, end quote, who is employed in the executive office of the President. Section 202A of Title 18 of the U.S. Code defines a special government employee to include D.C. employees. As a matter of law, the D.C. government is not part of the federal government, and D.C. employees are not federal employees. Section 202A of Title 18 of the U.S. Code was first enacted in 1962 before the district had home rule. In 1962, D.C. employees were part of the federal personnel system. After enactment of the Home Rule Act in 1973, D.C. developed its own personnel system. D.C. employees are now part of the D.C. personnel system and are no longer part of the federal personnel system. Unfortunately, Congress did not update all the definitions of the U.S. Code to account for the removal of D.C. employees from the federal personnel system. The term special government the term special government employee is one of those instances. DC employees should be treated the same as state and local employees. This bill does not apply to any state or local government employees, and therefore it should not apply to any DC employees. While there are almost certainly no DC, state, or local government employees in the executive office of the president, as a matter of principle, I am offering this amendment so that DC employees are treated the same as employees of state and local governments. I also note the applicability of this bill to DC may not administratable. Because DC employees are employed by DC and not the federal government, they file their financial disclosure statements with the DC government, not the federal government. I urge adoption of my amendment, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I want to thank Ms. Norton for offering this amendment aimed at ensuring that employees of the Washington, D.C. government are not unintentionally captured in the provisions of the underlying bill. I'm glad to assure Ms. Norton that the special employees in the bill only include those who are employed in the executive office of the president. Since the bill's definition of an agency distinguishes between each executive agency and each component of the executive office of the president, any Washington, D.C. employees who are not employed in the executive office of the president would not be covered by this bill. Therefore, a special exclusion for D.C. officials is unnecessary. I therefore oppose this amendment's inclusion in the underlying bill. Do any other members seek recognition? Chair recognizes Mr. Langworthy from York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the underlying bill is aimed at easing access to otherwise publicly available financial and ethics disclosure records, such filings for employees of Washington, D.C. government that may one day exist should not be exempted. Notably, we are unaware of any D.C. government employees employed in the executive office of the president, so the underlying bill already would not actually apply to anyone, making this amendment unnecessary. However, if for some reason, under an unknown future circumstance, a D.C. government employee were to become employed in the executive office of the president and be subject to the federal financial and ethics disclosure laws, the gentlelady's amendment would specifically exempt their records from being included in the respective publicly accessible database. There's no good reason for the filings for a federal employee that are otherwise required to be included in the database should not be exposed to the same public scrutiny as others by the sheer virtue of their being a D.C. employee. That's why I oppose this amendment, and I encourage my colleagues to do the same. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any other members seek recognition? Chair recognizes ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just heard Mr. Langworthy's explanation. The problem is that other state and local government employees who also conceivably could end up in the White House are not covered here. And I think the gentlelady from the District of Columbia is just asking for a uniformity and symmetry of treatment among people who are in local and state governments, which seems to make sense to me. So I don't see any problem with cleaning it up in this way. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Do any other members wish to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment offered by Ms. Norton. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. The question is now on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor. What? Yeah. The question is now on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The question is now on favorably reporting HR.
It's not agreed to.
The amendment is not agreed. Yeah. That was the A and S.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're right.
We said amendment.
Okay. All right.